Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The day Alex moved into the house next door, I remember thinking how much quieter the neighborhood had been before. The rumble of his moving truck, the clatter of furniture being unloaded, and the occasional bark of commands to the movers shattered the usual suburban calm. It was the kind of disturbance that should have annoyed me, but instead, I found myself standing at the window watching. Alex was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of effortless confidence that made people take notice. He wore his dark hair a little too perfectly, his smile coming easily as he bantered with the movers. Even from my vantage point, I could sense a charm that felt out of place in our sleepy cul-de-sac. My wife, Sarah, appeared at my side, holding a cup of coffee. "New neighbors?" she asked, her tone light. "Looks like it," I said. "He's already making an impression." She leaned closer to the window, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Well, it'll be nice to have someone new around. I should bake something, introduce ourselves." "Isn't that more of a thing for the new neighbor to do?" I asked with a smirk. Sarah shrugged, her lips curving into a smile. "Maybe, but it's a good excuse to meet him. Besides, if we're lucky, he'll be better than the Johnsons." The Johnsons, our former neighbors, had been an elderly couple with a penchant for gossip and an overly enthusiastic garden that frequently spilled into our yard. They'd moved to Florida a few months earlier, leaving the house next door empty until now. Later that afternoon, Alex was out on his porch, unpacking boxes, when Sarah walked over with a plate of cookies. I watched from the living room, pretending to read while keeping one eye on the interaction. Alex greeted her warmly, his grin as wide as it had been earlier. They exchanged pleasantries, and I saw Sarah laugh at something he said, her head tilting back slightly. It was a small moment, nothing unusual, but it stuck with me. When she returned, I tried to sound casual. "How's the new neighbor?" "Friendly," she said, setting the now empty plate on the counter. "His name's Alex. He's a contractor. Just moved here from Chicago." "A contractor?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Guess that explains the fancy truck." "Probably. He seems nice," Sarah added, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Said he's hoping to settle down here. Likes the quiet." Quiet wasn't the first word that came to mind when I thought of Alex. There was something about him, an energy that felt too big for a place like this. Over the next few weeks, Alex became a fixture in our cul-de-sac. He waved to neighbors, helped fix a broken fence for the Smiths, and even hosted a small barbecue to get to know everyone. Sarah and I attended, though I spent most of the evening nursing a beer and watching Alex hold court in his backyard. He moved through the crowd with ease, his charm magnetic. Sarah seemed to enjoy his company. She laughed at his jokes, engaged in animated conversation, and even helped him carry out trays of food from the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing. Sarah was social by nature, always the first to welcome someone new or lend a helping hand. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't help noticing how often she mentioned Alex in passing. "Alex offered to help with the lawnmower," she'd say. Or, "Alex told me about this great coffee shop downtown we should try." Each mention felt like a pebble in my shoe. Small, but impossible to ignore. One Saturday, I came home from running errands to find Alex in our driveway, his truck parked beside Sarah's car. He was holding a toolbox, and Sarah was standing beside him, pointing toward the garage. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping out of my car. Sarah turned a little too quickly. The garage door was sticking again. Alex offered to take a look. I forced a smile. "Appreciate it, but I could have handled it." "No problem," Alex said, his grin easy. "Just lending a hand." I stood there, watching as he fiddled with the garage door mechanism. He worked quickly, his confidence irritatingly apparent. When he finished, Sarah clapped her hands lightly. "Thank you, Alex. That's been driving me crazy." "Anytime," he said, flashing her a smile before turning to me. "Nice meeting you, man." We shook hands, his grip firm. As he climbed into his truck and drove off, I felt an uneasy knot settle in my stomach. Sarah leaned against the garage door, her expression light. "See? New neighbors aren't so bad." I nodded, but the knot remained. Something about Alex didn't sit right with me, and the way Sarah smiled when she talked about him, it was the kind of smile I hadn't seen in a long time. It didn't take long for Alex's presence to shift from novel to unsettling. Sarah's casual mentions of him became more frequent, her tone brightening whenever she talked about something he'd said or done. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was reading too much into innocent gestures. But the unease in my chest grew with every passing day. The first real crack appeared on a sunny Saturday afternoon. I'd spent the morning fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, one of the many small tasks that had been piling up around the house. When I stepped outside to grab a wrench from the garage, I saw them. Sarah and Alex stood by the fence dividing our yards, laughing about something. She held a glass of iced tea, her hair glinting in the sunlight, while Alex leaned casually against the fence post, his arms crossed. The sight made me stop in my tracks. "Hey!" I called, forcing a smile as I approached. "What's so funny?" They both turned toward me, their smiles still lingering. "Alex was telling me about his dog," Sarah said, gesturing toward his yard. "Apparently, it's a rescue, and it's completely obsessed with chasing squirrels." "Yeah, she's relentless," Alex added, his grin easy. "I've had to replace 3 leashes already." "Sounds like a handful," I said, keeping my tone light. "We should get her and Lucky together sometime." Lucky, our golden retriever, lay sprawled in the shade of the porch, oblivious to the conversation. Alex nodded. "I'd like that. She could use the socialization." The conversation fizzled after that, and Alex excused himself, saying he had errands to run. As he walked away, I turned to Sarah. "You two seem to be getting along pretty well. What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just an observation." She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shrugged and sipped her tea. "He's just friendly, Michael. Don't make it weird." That evening, I couldn't shake the image of them at the fence. Sarah had looked so at ease, so engaged. It wasn't that she couldn't enjoy a conversation with someone else. Of course she could. But there was something about the way she'd laughed, the way her eyes had lit up, that gnawed at me. Over dinner, the tension lingered. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone. Sarah seemed oblivious, chatting about the new recipe she wanted to try in a show she'd heard good things about. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you think you've been spending a lot of time with Alex?" I asked, my voice casual but pointed. Sarah looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it feels like you're always talking about him lately," I said, setting my fork down. "Every time I turn around, you're at the fence or mentioning something he said." Her brow furrowed. "Michael, he's our neighbor. Am I not supposed to talk to him?" "Of course you can talk to him," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "It just feels like there's more to it." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" I countered. "Because it seems like he's always around, and you don't seem to mind one bit." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she pushed her chair back abruptly. "I can't believe we're having this conversation," she said, standing. "He's a neighbor, Michael. That's all." "Then why does it feel like he's more than that?" I asked, my voice rising. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her plate and took it to the sink, her back to me as she rinsed it off. The sound of running water filled the silence between us. That night, Sarah went to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened television, replaying the argument in my head. Was I overreacting? Was this just my own insecurity rearing its head? Or was there something real behind my unease? I didn't have an answer, but as I lay awake in the guest room, the walls of the house seemed to close in around me. I could hear the faint murmur of Sarah's voice upstairs, speaking softly, to herself or maybe on the phone. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension between Sarah and me hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Every interaction with Alex, no matter how innocent it seemed, now carried an added weight. I found myself watching them closely, searching for signs of something more, even as I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the air conditioning. As I set my bag down, I noticed the faint sound of laughter coming from the backyard. Curious, I stepped outside. There they were, Sarah and Alex, standing near the garden. She held a hose, spraying water over the flower beds, while he stood beside her, gesturing animatedly about something. Her laughter rang out, light and carefree in a way I hadn't heard in months. "Hey!" I called, stepping off the porch. Sarah turned, her smile faltering slightly when she saw me. "You're home early." "Figured I'd call it a day," I said, walking toward them. My eyes flicked to Alex, who stood with his hands in his pockets, a relaxed smile on his face. "What's going on?" "Alex was showing me some tips for the garden," Sarah said quickly. "He knows a lot about landscaping." "Yeah, just giving a few pointers," Alex added. "Didn't mean to interrupt anything." "You're fine," I said, though the knot in my stomach tightened. "I'll leave you to it." I turned and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the image of them standing together, their easy camaraderie. It wasn't that they'd done anything overtly wrong. It was the way she looked at him, the way she laughed, as if she'd forgotten I was even part of the equation. A few days later, it happened again. I was in the garage, sorting through tools, when I heard voices nearby. Peering out, I saw Sarah and Alex standing by his truck, their heads bent together over something on his phone. As I watched, her hand brushed against his arm, a fleeting, accidental touch that seemed to linger longer than necessary. The sight made my chest tighten. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. People touched each other all the time, didn't they? It didn't mean anything. But the way Alex smiled at her, the way she leaned in slightly as they spoke, made it impossible to dismiss. That evening, I couldn't keep quiet. "Do you think you're spending too much time with Alex?" I asked as we sat on the couch, the TV playing in the background. Sarah glanced at me, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I see you with him all the time," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "The garden, the driveway, the fence. It's starting to feel like he's here more than I am." She sighed, setting down the remote. "Michael, he's just a neighbor. We're friends. That's all." "Are you sure about that?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Because it feels like there's more to it." Her expression hardened. "I can't believe you're accusing me of whatever it is you're thinking. Alex has been nothing but nice. Maybe you should try talking to him instead of making assumptions." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. She stood, crossing her arms. "I'm going to bed," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm done having this conversation." As she walked upstairs, I stayed on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen. The accidental touches, the laughter, the easy way she talked about him. It all replayed in my mind. I told myself again that I was overreacting, that I was letting jealousy cloud my judgment. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was changing between us, and Alex was at the center of it. The next morning, I caught them again, this time in the driveway. Sarah handed Alex a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing as he took it. The gesture was so small, so mundane, but it felt like a confirmation of everything I feared. I stood by the kitchen window, my heart pounding as I watched them laugh together. The knot in my stomach tightened, and I turned away, gripping the counter to steady myself. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was a Friday evening when the shift became undeniable. Sarah had been restless all day, moving through the house with a strange energy that I couldn't place. She'd spent extra time on her hair and makeup, which wasn't unusual in itself, but paired with her cheerful mood and frequent glances at her phone, it set me on edge. "Big plans tonight?" I asked casually as I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her pull on a light jacket. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before smiling. "I'm meeting up with some of the girls. We're going to that new wine bar downtown." I nodded, forcing a neutral expression. Sounds fun. Anyone I know? Oh, just Karen and some of her friends, she said, waving a hand dismissively. Don't wait up. She kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture that left me colder than it should have, and was out the door before I could respond. The moment the front door closed, I felt a knot of doubt tighten in my chest. Something about her explanation didn't sit right. Grabbing my keys, I decided to go for a drive. It wasn't that I wanted to follow her, I told myself. I just needed to clear my head. But as I turned out of the driveway, I couldn't help but notice the direction Sarah had taken. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I found myself driving toward the wine bar she'd mentioned. The parking lot was small and crowded, but Sarah's car wasn't there. My pulse quickened as I drove past slowly, scanning the street for any sign of her. Maybe I'd missed it. Maybe she'd parked somewhere else. Or maybe I shook the thought away, forcing myself to think rationally. But instead of heading home, I found myself looping through downtown, looking for her car. It was near the edge of town, in the lot of a small Italian restaurant, that I finally spotted it. My stomach dropped as I parked across the street, watching from the shadows. Minutes later, Sarah emerged from the restaurant. She wasn't alone. Alex walked beside her, his hand lightly brushing the small of her back as they laughed together. They stood by his truck for a moment, talking animatedly, before he opened the door for her. She climbed in, her smile wide and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in years. My chest tightened as Alex walked around to the driver's side and got in. Moments later, the truck pulled out of the lot, and I sat frozen in place, watching the taillights disappear into the night. When I got home, the house felt emptier than it ever had. I sat in the living room, the quiet pressing down on me as I tried to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to confront Sarah the moment she walked through the door, demand an explanation for her lies and the intimacy I'd witnessed. But another part of me hesitated, unsure of what I'd gain from the confrontation. Would she deny it? Would she twist the truth into something unrecognizable? Hours later, when she finally came home, I was still sitting in the dark. She seemed startled to see me awake, but she recovered quickly, offering a breezy explanation about the long night with Karen and the others. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, and mumbled something about being tired before heading upstairs. I couldn't bear to hear her lie to me again. The next day, Sarah acted as though nothing had happened. She moved through the house with her usual ease, humming softly as she tidied up and made coffee. But I couldn't shake the image of her with Alex, the way she'd smiled at him, the way they'd leaned into each other as though no one else in the world existed. By the afternoon, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers. Waiting and hoping for Sarah to come clean on her own wasn't an option anymore. "Do you want to talk about last night?" I asked, my voice calm but firm, as she stood by the sink. She froze, her hand pausing over the dish she was washing. "What do you mean?" "I mean the dinner," I said, stepping closer. "The one you had with Alex." Her shoulders stiffened, and she turned to face me, her expression carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," I said, my voice sharper now. "I saw you, Sarah. I followed you. I know you weren't with Karen. So just tell me the truth." For a moment, she didn't speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then she sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It was just dinner," she said quietly. "That's all. And you thought it was fine to lie about it?" I asked, my anger rising. "To sneak around behind my back?" "I didn't want you to overreact," she said, her voice defensive now. "It was nothing, Michael. Just dinner between friends." "Friends don't lie about seeing each other," I shot back. "Friends don't touch each other like that." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she masked it. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I asked, stepping closer. "Because it doesn't feel that way, Sarah. It feels like there's more to this than you're admitting." She shook her head, turning away from me. "I'm done with this conversation," she said, her voice cold. "Believe what you want." As she walked away, I felt the weight of her words settle over me. The distance between us had never felt greater, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if we'd ever find our way back to each other. The days that followed our confrontation were filled with an uneasy silence. Sarah avoided my questions, deflecting with vague responses and spending more time out of the house. I was left in the empty spaces she left behind, questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. The tension simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. It came on a rainy Thursday evening. The downpour had started hours earlier, drumming steadily against the windows as I sat in the living room, flipping through channels but watching nothing. Sarah had been gone since the morning, and though she claimed she was at work, her recent patterns left me doubtful. When she finally came home, the sound of her car in the driveway sent a jolt through me. I stood as she walked in, shaking rain off her jacket. She paused when she saw me, her expression guarded. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Yeah," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Traffic was terrible." I nodded, watching as she hung up her coat. There was something different about her tonight. An edge to her movements, a nervous energy that set me on high alert. "Where were you?" I asked. She froze, her back to me. "I told you. Work." "And after that?" I pressed. She turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at, Michael?" I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "I think you know. I think you've been hiding something from me, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "You're imagining things," she said, her voice tight. "I've been working late, that's all." "With Alex?" I asked, the name coming out sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened briefly before she masked her reaction. "He's a friend," she said. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" I stepped closer, the space between us charged with tension. "Because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're not telling me the truth, Sarah. And I need to know." The silence that followed was deafening. She looked at me, her expression a mix of defiance and guilt, and for a moment, I thought she might finally confess. But instead, she turned away, walking toward the stairs. "I'm going to bed," she said over her shoulder. "This conversation is over." Later that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as rain continued to batter the windows. Sarah was beside me, her breathing steady but shallow, as though she weren't fully asleep. The distance between us felt insurmountable, an invisible wall that neither of us seemed willing to tear down. Then she moved, shifting closer to me. Her hand brushed against my arm, the touch light but deliberate. I turned to look at her, and in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, I saw her watching me. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Then she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a tentative kiss. It was different from the kisses we'd shared before, hesitant, almost pleading. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, longing, confusion. But I didn't pull away. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. The weight of our recent fights seemed to dissolve, replaced by something raw and desperate. I responded in kind, my hands moving to her waist, holding her as though she might slip away. "Michael," she murmured against my lips, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose us." "Then tell me the truth," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "No more lies, Sarah. No more hiding." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might finally say the words I'd been dreading. But instead, she kissed me again, her actions speaking louder than her silence. We clung to each other in the dark, the storm outside a mirror to the chaos within. The next morning, Sarah was gone before I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, the sheets neatly smoothed over. A note on the kitchen counter said she had errands to run, but it felt like an excuse to avoid the conversation we both knew was coming. As I stood in the empty kitchen, the memory of her touch lingered, but so did the questions. Last night had been a temporary reprieve, a moment of connection in the midst of our unraveling. But the truth was still out there, waiting to be confronted, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. After that stormy night, things between Sarah and me felt strangely suspended, as if we were both waiting for something to shift. Her gestures toward me became warmer, more deliberate. A hand brushing my arm as she passed, a smile that lingered a second longer than it should have. But beneath those gestures lay an unspoken tension, a weight neither of us could bring ourselves to acknowledge. I wanted to believe we were finding our way back to each other. But then there was Alex. It began subtly. I'd catch glimpses of him in passing, walking to his truck or tending to his yard. Sometimes he'd stop and chat with Sarah at the fence. Their conversations always seemed friendly enough, but there was an ease between them that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the casual friendliness of neighbors. It was something else. One Saturday, I decided to work in the garage, keeping the door open for some air. From my vantage point, I could see the backyard, where Sarah was kneeling in the garden, pulling weeds. Alex appeared a few minutes later, carrying a bag of mulch over his shoulder. "Thought you could use a hand," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. Sarah looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and smiled. "Thanks, but you don't have to do that." "It's no trouble," he replied, setting the bag down and crouching beside her. They spoke quietly, their voices too low for me to hear, but I could see the way Sarah's body leaned slightly toward him, her movements relaxed. My hands clenched into fists as I watched them. It was nothing, just a neighborly gesture, I told myself. But the knot in my stomach told a different story. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to test the waters. "Alex is a pretty helpful guy," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Sarah glanced at me, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "Yeah, he's great." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just seems like he's around a lot lately." Her brow furrowed. "He's our neighbor, Michael. It's not unusual for neighbors to help each other out." "I know," I said, forcing a smile. "Just an observation." She didn't respond, but I noticed the way her posture stiffened slightly, her shoulders tightening. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. The following week, I came home early from work. The house was quiet, and for a moment, I thought Sarah wasn't home. Then I heard laughter coming from the backyard. My chest tightened as I walked to the window, peering out through the curtains. Sarah and Alex were sitting on the patio, 2 glasses of iced tea on the table between them. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back in a way that made her hair catch the light. Alex leaned forward, his posture relaxed but attentive, his smile easy. They looked comfortable together, too comfortable. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking. It felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see, even though it was happening in my own home. The knot in my stomach tightened, and for a moment, I considered storming outside, demanding to know what was going on. But instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. That night, I confronted her again. "Do you think it's appropriate, spending so much time with Alex?" I asked as we lay in bed. Sarah sighed, rolling onto her side to face me. "We're friends, Michael. That's all. It doesn't look like just friends from where I'm standing," I said, my voice tight. "He's here all the time. You laugh with him, you sit with him. It feels like you're more comfortable with him than you are with me." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge the tension between us. But then she shook her head. "You're overthinking this. Alex is a nice guy. That doesn't mean there's anything inappropriate going on." "Then why do I feel like I'm losing you?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "You're not losing me, Michael. I'm still here." But her words felt hollow, and as she turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. The sense of unease had become unbearable, consuming my every waking thought. Sarah and Alex's interactions had grown too frequent, too comfortable, for me to ignore. Each laugh, each shared moment, felt like another thread unraveling the fabric of our marriage. And then, one night, the situation took a dangerous turn. It was late when Sarah stepped out for what she claimed was a quick run to the store. Her explanations had grown more casual, her comings and goings less accounted for, as though she no longer felt the need to justify herself. I sat by the window, watching as her taillights disappeared into the night, the knot in my stomach tightening. Unable to sit idle, I grabbed my keys and followed her. It wasn't the first time I'd done this, but tonight felt different. The air was charged with a sense of finality. I kept my distance as her car wound through familiar streets, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit bar. From my vantage point across the street, I saw her step out of the car and look around. Moments later, Alex emerged from the shadows, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dim light. They exchanged a few words before walking inside together, their body language far too familiar. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and betrayal surging through me. This was no longer a suspicion or a feeling, this was undeniable. They were meeting in secret, and they hadn't even bothered to hide it. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I fought the urge to storm inside and confront them. Instead, I waited. Minutes turned into an hour as I sat there, my thoughts spiraling. What would I say? What could I do? I felt powerless, trapped between my anger and the fear of what I might discover if I faced them head-on. Finally, they emerged. Sarah laughed at something Alex said, her head tilting back in a way that made my blood boil. He placed a hand on the small of her back as they walked to his truck, their movements unhurried, unashamed. I watched as she climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove off together into the night. When I returned home, the house felt suffocatingly empty. I paced the living room, my mind racing with scenarios of what they were doing, where they were going. Every thought felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into the fragile remnants of my trust. Then I saw it, the knife. It lay on the kitchen counter, a simple tool we'd used 1,000 times to prepare meals together. But now, its presence felt ominous, its sharp edge catching the light. My hand hovered over it, the weight of my anger and frustration bearing down on me. I grabbed the knife, the cold steel pressing against my palm, and before I knew it, I was back in my car. My thoughts were a blur, a mix of rage and despair driving me forward. I knew where they'd gone, Alex's house. I'd seen the way Sarah's smile softened when she talked about his place, the way she seemed to know the details of his life more intimately than she should. As I approached his street, my headlights off, I saw Sarah's car parked outside. The sight sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me, my grip on the knife tightening. I parked a few houses down, stepping out into the cool night air, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights in Alex's house were on, the soft glow spilling through the windows. I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the damp grass. When I reached the window, I peered inside, my breath catching in my throat. There they were, sitting on the couch. Sarah's legs were tucked beneath her, her posture relaxed as she leaned toward Alex. He was saying something, his expression animated, and she laughed in response, the sound muffled but unmistakable. They looked so comfortable, so at ease, as though I didn't exist. The knife felt heavy in my hand, the sharp edge pressing against my skin. My mind raced with thoughts of what I could do, what I should do. The betrayal burned in my chest, fueling a dark impulse I barely recognized. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, coming from the house next door. A child's laughter, light and carefree, carried through the night air. It cut through my anger like a blade, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I froze, the knife slipping from my hand and landing softly in the grass. What was I doing? How had I let it come to this? I stumbled back, retreating to the shadows as my pulse thundered in my ears. The sight of them together still burned in my mind, but the darkness that had consumed me moments before began to fade. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling. I sat there for a long time, staring at the knife on the passenger seat, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. When Sarah came home hours later, I was sitting in the living room, the knife back in the kitchen where it belonged. She seemed startled to see me awake, her smile faltering as she walked through the door. "You're up late," she said, her voice cautious. "So are you?" I replied, my tone even. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a clue to what I might know. But I said nothing, letting the silence speak for itself. She turned and went upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the realization that this wasn't over. Not yet. The morning after that tense and sleepless night, I knew I couldn't keep living in the shadows of suspicion. Something had to give. The weight of what I'd seen of Sarah's lies and my own near breaking point was too much to bear. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the cost. Sarah moved through the house that morning with a careful air, her words clipped and her movements deliberate. She avoided my eyes, and I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. It was as if she knew what was coming but hoped to outrun it. I wasn't going to let her. "Sarah," I said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen as she poured coffee. "We need to talk." She froze, her hand hovering over the mug, before setting the pot down and turning to face me. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe. "About what?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "About Alex," I said, stepping into the room. "About the nights you've been lying to me. About what's really going on." Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The silence between us stretched thin, taut with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, she sighed, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Michael, I swear." "Don't," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "Don't try to spin this into something it's not. I saw you last night, Sarah. I followed you. I saw you with him." Her face paled, the blood draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked as though she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Even though I'd suspected, even though I'd seen the signs, hearing her admit it was something else entirely. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "A few months," she admitted. "It started innocently. We were just talking. And then what?" I demanded, stepping closer. "You decided to throw everything we built away for him? For some neighbor?" Tears filled her eyes, spilling over as she shook her head. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't plan this, Michael. I didn't want this. But I felt so alone, so disconnected from you. And Alex, he listened. He made me feel seen." "Seen," I repeated bitterly, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You think I haven't been here? That I haven't been trying? God, Sarah, do you have any idea what you've done to us?" She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, I just stood there, watching the woman I'd once loved more than anything fall apart before me. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, they all swirled inside me, threatening to overwhelm me. But beneath it all, there was something else. Exhaustion. I was tired of fighting, tired of wondering, tired of trying to hold together something that was already broken. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I even want to." Her sobs grew quieter, and she lowered her hands, looking at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Therapy, counseling, anything. Just, please, don't give up on us." I shook my head, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "You already gave up, Sarah. The moment you let him into our lives, you made that choice." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Sarah stayed upstairs, her presence a ghostly shadow in the house. I avoided her, unable to face her without the anger and hurt rising to the surface. My mind raced with questions. Could we fix this? Did I even want to try? Or was it already too late? That evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photos on the mantel. There we were, smiling on our wedding day, laughing on a beach vacation, celebrating some long-forgotten anniversary. Each image felt like a cruel reminder of what we'd lost, of the life we'd built and the betrayal that had torn it apart. As I sat there, the front door opened, and Sarah stepped out into the night. I didn't follow her this time. I didn't need to. The truth was already out, and there was no running from it anymore. The air in the house felt heavier after Sarah's confession. Each passing moment seemed to drag, punctuated only by the silence that hung between us. There was no yelling, no further accusations. Just a quiet that carried the weight of everything we both knew but couldn't bear to say aloud. I woke the next morning to find her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept, her face pale and drawn, her hair pulled back in a haphazard knot. For a moment, I considered walking past her, retreating upstairs to avoid the conversation we both knew was coming. But instead, I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the strain of the past few days. Her gaze met mine, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something raw in her eyes. A mixture of regret, fear, and sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't even know where to start. Is there even a point to trying?" The question came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't help it. The bitterness that had taken root in my chest refused to be silenced. She flinched but didn't look away. "There's always a point," she said softly, "but I can't do it alone. I need to know if you're willing to try." I exhaled deeply, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not sure I can," I said honestly. "Every time I look at you, all I see is him. Every word you say, every time you touch me. It's like there's this wall between us that I can't break through." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, placing her hand on mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond either. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed so much of what we had. But if there's even a chance." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. Finally, I stood, sliding my hand out from under hers. "I need some time," I said, "to think, to figure out if this is something I can live with." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of the conversation had finally crushed her. "Take as much time as you need," she said, her voice barely audible. I spent the next several days away from the house. I stayed with a friend, explaining only that Sarah and I were going through something. He didn't ask questions, and for that I was grateful. The space gave me clarity, but it also left me grappling with the reality of our situation. The truth was I loved Sarah. Despite everything, despite the lies and betrayal, I couldn't erase the years we'd spent together or the life we'd built. But love alone didn't feel like enough anymore. Trust was gone, and without it, love felt hollow. When I finally returned home, the atmosphere was tense but calm. Sarah had packed a few bags, her suitcase sitting by the door when I walked in. "I thought it might be best if I stayed somewhere else for a while," she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. I nodded, unable to argue. "Where will you go?" "A friend's place," she said. "Just for now. To give us both some space." I looked at her, taking in the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of the situation. She wasn't the same woman I'd married, and I wasn't the same man she'd promised to love. "Maybe that's for the best," I said quietly. Her tears came then, silent but steady. She stepped closer, hesitating before reaching up to touch my face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of it. For him, for the lies, for everything." I closed my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know," I said, "but sometimes sorry isn't enough." I watched her leave, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing in the empty house. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the spot where she'd been. The house felt impossibly quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. But nothing came, and for the first time in weeks, I realized I was truly alone. The weeks following Sarah's departure were a whirlwind of logistical arrangements and painful realizations. Our separation was no longer an abstract concept but a tangible, inescapable reality. Each day brought a new set of decisions: who would keep the house, how to split the finances, and what to do with the memories we had shared. Our communication became limited to text messages and emails, stripped of emotion and focused solely on practicalities. Sarah's lawyer reached out to mine, and the official paperwork began to take shape. The process was cold and impersonal, reducing our years together to a series of legal agreements and signatures. The day of the court hearing arrived with little fanfare. The courtroom was sterile and quiet, the air heavy with formality. Sarah sat across the aisle, her lawyer beside her. She wore a simple black dress, her hair neatly tied back, her face pale but composed. I avoided meeting her eyes, focusing instead on the papers in front of me. The judge began the proceedings, reviewing the terms of our divorce. The house would be sold, the proceeds split evenly. The savings account would be divided, and neither of us would receive spousal support. It was fair, reasonable, and devoid of any acknowledgement of the emotions that had brought us here. When it came time to speak, Sarah's voice was steady but quiet. She acknowledged the breakdown of our marriage, expressing regret without delving into specifics. It was a measured performance, carefully constructed to avoid blame or further conflict. When it was my turn, I kept my words brief. I spoke about the trust that had been broken, the love that had been lost, and the hope that we could both find closure in moving forward. My voice cracked once, betraying the emotions I had fought so hard to suppress. After the hearing, Sarah and I stood outside the courthouse, the crisp autumn air biting at our faces. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. "So, this is it," she said finally, her voice soft. "Yeah," I replied, shoving my hands into my pockets. "This is it." She hesitated, then reached out, her fingers brushing my arm. "I'm sorry, Michael, for everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. After a moment, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. I watched her go, my chest heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The house was quiet that evening, emptier than it had ever felt. I stood in the living room, staring at the photos still hanging on the walls. I knew I should take them down, pack them away, and begin the process of letting go. But for now, they remained, silent witnesses to a life that no longer existed. As I sat on the couch, the finality of the divorce settled over me like a weight. The anger and betrayal had dulled, replaced by a quiet sadness. But beneath that sadness was a flicker of something else. Hope. Hope that this ending, painful as it was, might also be a beginning. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future. A future where the wounds healed, where the house was filled with new memories, and where I could rebuild a life from the pieces Sarah and I had left behind. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.